It's exactly 12:01. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And welcome to this month's edition of African Liberty webinar. And AfricanLiberty.org is a project of Students for Liberty Africa. You can follow this discussion on Twitter with the hashtag African Liberty Webinar or hashtag WhyAfricaField. You can post your questions in the comment section or ask them directly on Twitter using this same hashtag WhyAfricaField, hashtag African Liberty Webinar. This webinar will last for 1 hour and 30 minutes. This month, we have the honor of having with us one of Africa's most vocal voices against tyranny and pro-responsible governance and economic freedom, Judge P.N. Ayittey. Judge Ayittey is a Ghanaian economist known for his arguments that Africa is poor because she is not free. He asserts that the corruption of autocrats and complacency of citizens are the bedrock problems in the majority of African states. Dr. Ayittey calls for a democratic government, debt re-examination, modern infrastructure, free market economics, and free trade to promote development. He established the Free Africa Foundation in 1993 to serve as a catalyst for reform, and was named one of foreign policy's top 100 public intellectuals in 2008 and top 100 global thinkers in 2009. He has written several books, including Defeating Dictators, Fighting Tyranny in Africa and Around the World, published in 2011. He also serves as the Human Rights Foundation International Council. He was an economics professor at the American University in Washington, D.C., and was an associate scholar at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Professor Ayittey, it's an honor to have you with us today, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. And I also would like to welcome all those who found some time to come and participate in this webinar. And to move forward, I think I'd like to give the listeners, and I'm going to assume that they haven't done economics before and they have no economics knowledge. So I'm going to speak to them in the plainest language that I can for them to absorb what I'm going to say. Now, I'd like to give them an analogy of how to understand the current problems that we face in Africa. And as most of us know, we haven't made much progress in the post-colonial period in terms of development. Now, development can be considered as going on a journey from point A, which is a state of underdevelopment, to point B, a developed state. And to do so, you need a vehicle, and you need road, and you need a strategy, and also you need a driver. Now, in most African countries right now, what we have is we have a bad driver, bad vehicle, bad roads, bad strategy, and angry Africans, passengers, who are fed up for lack of progress on the development journey. Now, we should always remember this: bad driver, bad vehicle, bad roads, bad strategy, angry passengers. So you have 4 bads. Now, later on in the talk, I'll talk about how to fix our economic development crisis. Now, first of all, when you talk about bad driver, obviously we mean the head of state and the ruling elites. They are those that they are those who are sort of control the vehicle. And then the vehicle itself represents the ship of state. That is the government, the state of the constitution, the government has how it enforces the rule of law, how it addresses the needs of the people, how it provides, ensures that electricity, water, and property rights are ensured in the country. That's all sums up to be the shape of state. And then when you talk about bad roads, the roads mean obviously the roads itself, roads, bridges, and then you have infrastructure, schools, clean water, education. All this sums up to be the roads. And then the strategy means whether you want to, how fast you want to get from point A to point B, whether you're going to allow free markets or whether you're going to allow the state or permit the state, only the state, to move the country on the development path. So remember that we have bad drivers, bad road, bad vehicle, bad strategy, and angry passengers. Now, how did we get to this? To understand this development crisis, we have to go back to the day of independence, when African countries won their freedom from white colonial rule. Now, after independence in the 60s, most African leaders argued that, well, the colonial system was a capitalist system, and we cannot afford to go the colonial route. So they opted for socialism, the antithesis of capitalism. Many of them adopted the socialist principle. Now, a whole range of socialist ideologies swept across Africa, from Ujamaa in Tanzania, Nyerere's Ujamaa in Tanzania, to Confucianism in Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah, and then you have Buddhism in Algeria. So many of these socialist principles swept across Africa. And get this, under socialism, the state was to take commanding heights of the economy. Ghana, for example, opted for complete ownership of the economy by the state. Now, socialism meant increasing participation of the state in the economy and the establishment of a whole range of state enterprises, and also the control of the state economy by the state by use of a plethora of regulations and controls. For example, price controls, foreign exchange controls. All these were established in many African countries to try and take control of the commanding heights of the economy. In Ghana, in Zambia, in Tanzania, there were only a few countries like Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Kenya, that did not opt for the doctrinaire socialism. But even then, in those countries, in Nigeria, for example, the state took an active part in development and came to control a huge sector of the state, a huge sector of the economy. In 1967, for example, the Nigerian government took control of the oil, 67% of the oil sector, and also the distribution of petroleum products in Nigeria. In Kenya, the government invested heavily in the tea industry. In Ivory Coast, the state was also instrumental in developing the cocoa plantation industry. So even though these countries said they eschewed doctrinaire socialism, they still have an active state role in the economy. Now let me get to the results of this were evident across Africa. The socialist experiment was a complete disaster. in Ghana, in Tanzania. In Tanzania, for example, the Tanzanian economy was virtually destroyed. Back in 1967, Tanzania was exporting cashews and also cotton. After the Ujamaa socialism, agricultural production fell almost by 30% in Tanzania. In Ghana, you have many state enterprises which could not even produce, and they are produce enough even to. The most dramatic example was the State Farm Corporation. Now, the state farmers, workers on the state farms, could not produce even enough food to feed themselves, let alone the entire country. I mean, you can go from country after country after country. The examples are horrible. Now, you might want to ask yourself, why did the socialist ideology fail so dramatically in Africa? Well, first of all, there were a couple of reasons. The first one was that by establishing price controls to control agricultural production and also to keep the prices of urban commodities cheap for the urban workers, the state were actually exploiting the peasant majority. By then, I mean price controls on food, for example, were in Tanzania, for example, the state was paying cotton farmers 20% of the world market price for their produce. In Senegal, the state was paying only 30% of the world peanut price to farmers. In Ghana, cocoa farmers were receiving only 40%. Now, what happened was that eventually the farmers rebelled. They said, look, we're not going to produce the crops for you to exploit. So gradually, agricultural production started to fall in Ghana, in Tanzania, in Senegal, and so forth. Now, the second reason why the socialist experiment failed was that there was an administrative ineptitude. They didn't have, well, listen to this, and maybe you might be able to sympathize in the sense that these countries had just won their independence. They didn't have the administrative capacity to run, let's say, modern factories. In Ghana, for example, when they built a Commander sugar factory, they discovered that somebody had forgotten to put in a water supply system. So the thing was mothballed for 2 years before it could start production. Now, in Nigeria, for example, the most horrific example of state-owned enterprise can be found in the Ajaokuta steel mill. It was started in 1975. The Nigerian government put down something like $8 billion. Now, since then, it had passed hands from Russians to Germans to Canadians, back and forth. And for the past something like 45 years, they haven't produced a single sheet of steel in that factory. And yet it has absorbed almost close to $20 billion. Now, the third reason why socialism failed was that the socialist ideology itself is alien to Africa. I mean, if you go into traditional Africa, nowhere can you see the state dominating any economy. If you go into traditional Africa, free markets were the rule. Village markets, in fact, free market, free enterprise, and free trade has always been the rule in traditional Africa. If you go to any market in Africa, it's always been dominated by women. And if you want to buy anything, you haggle and haggle over prices. African chiefs do not fix prices in traditional Africa. So after independence, they brought in an ideology which was totally alien. Nobody in traditional Africa lines up before the chiefs had to ask for permission to go into fishing or to become a farmer. People go into these occupations, fishing, farming, hunting, on their own volition, not at the behest of the state. Now that is something that must be made clear. All right, so for those three reasons, the socialist experiment in Africa, across Africa, was a disaster. And that is where we find ourselves today. In fact, the results of the socialist experiment became apparent in the 1980s when an economic crisis emerged. So African leaders went to the World Bank and the IMF to seek help in resolving the economic crisis in the 1980s. So the World Bank and the IMF put together a package known as Structural Adjustment Programs, SAP. Now, in 1981, 29 African countries signed up for the Structural Adjustment Program. Now, remember at that time in the 1980s, the vehicle was collapsed, was bad. The vehicle had broken and kaput. So African leaders went to the World Bank for help, and the World Bank and the IMF put together the Structural Adjustment Programs and then put up $25 billion to support the program. 29 African countries signed up. And between 1981 and 1991, the World Bank itself evaluated the results and discovered that the leaders took the money and did the Babangida boogie. One step forward, three steps back, a flip and a sidekick to land on a fat Swiss bank account. What I'm trying to portray to convey to you is that the leaders were not serious about reforming their abominable economic and political systems. They took the money and then simply squandered the money. So, of the 29 African countries which were reforming their economies, only 6 of them were adjudged to be success stories in 1994 by the World Bank. And those 6 countries were the Gambia, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. Only 6 out of 29 countries. Now, if you take 6 out of 29 countries and you had put up $25 billion to support them, then it means that the failure rate was almost 80% or more. Now, why was such a failure? Why was such a high failure rate? The main reason was that, the leadership established defective economic and political systems. The political system that they established was a system which was not democratic at all. A system which was, you may call it sultanism. It concentrated a great deal of power in the hands of the state. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to notice that. If you create a political system and concentrate a great deal of power in the hands of one person, that system, no matter where you are, will always degenerate into tyranny. Now, during the struggle for independence, African leaders themselves demanded that Africans should have to participate in the decision-making process and that the colonialists should establish democratic systems. But then when they won independence and became heads of state of their respective countries, they themselves did not establish democratic systems. In fact, in 1990, 30 years after independence, only 4 African countries were democratic. 4 countries were democratic 30 years after independence. And these countries were the Gambia, Senegal, Botswana, and Mauritius. That was in 1990. Now, fast forward to today. If you fast forward to today, only 17 countries today are democratic. Now, of those 17 countries, it means that if 4 countries were democratic in 1990 and today in 2019, 17 countries out of 84 countries are democratic, then it means that it will take Africa more than 80 years. Now, let me repeat that. More than 80 years for Africa to be fully democratic. Now, the hypocritical aspect of this is that these were leaders who back in 1950s were demanding democratic rule. And they themselves never established democracy when they became heads of state of their respective countries. Now, what this means is that there are many places in Africa where Africans are now yearning for democracy. We've seen what happened in Sudan, and we've seen what happened also briefly in Egypt about a week ago. Now we're going to see more stirrings for freedom in many countries like Eritrea. You're going to see more in Chad, in Mali, and so forth. Now, all this stirrings for freedom creates political instability, but that's a different topic. Now, let me go back to the other reason why things went so wrong. We established a defective political system and also a defective economic system. A defective economic system based on state controls under the guise of socialism. And as I indicated briefly, that kind of system is alien. Go to the traditional system. Go to the village market. If you go to any market in Africa, go to Onitsha market in Nigeria, you find people going back and forth and trading all the time. They do so on their own volition. These are free traders, free marketers. They are not doing so because their chief or kings ask them to do so. They are doing so on their own volition. And they do so to make a profit. There's nothing wrong in making a profit in traditional Africa. Now, as I indicated, market activity has always been dominated by women. Prices are not fixed by African chiefs or kings. You bargain over prices in traditional Africa. Then so you ask yourself, how come after independence all of a sudden we're imposing price controls on goods in Africa? In Ghana, for example, in 1982, the Rawlings regime was blowing up markets and burning down markets because the traders refused to obey government dictated prices. Those were the reasons. All these defective economic system, defective political system, exploitation of the peasant majority, administrative ineptitude. These were the reasons why Africa did not develop in the post-colonial period. As I said, we had bad driver, bad vehicle, bad roads, bad strategy, and angry passengers who were fed up with lack of progress. So now, the next question is, how do we fix our problems and move Africa forward? Obviously, we have to change the bad driver, fix the bad vehicle, and then fix the bad roads, change the strategy, and then move forward. Now, we started doing this in the 1980s, but we haven't gotten very far. The reason why we haven't gotten very far is because we are not looking at the problem as I indicated that we should do. That we should look at the driver, the vehicle, the roads, the strategy, and so forth. In case after case, we only change the bad driver, but we don't fix the vehicle. So we change the driver through revolutionary means, elections, but then we don't fix the vehicle. But then you see, if you change the driver, if the vehicle doesn't have good brakes, the brakes are defective, and you change the driver, you're still going to land in a ditch. So a defective vehicle will land in the ditch regardless of whether the driver is Nelson Mandela or somebody else. You're going to land in the ditch. But we see we never paid attention. In fact, if you look at the experience of, take Liberia, for example. There was a civil war in Liberia. Charles Taylor removed Samuel Doe from power, but then Charles Taylor never fixed the bad vehicle. So you change the driver, you don't change the vehicle, you don't fix the vehicle. You're still going to land in a ditch. Ethiopia, we changed the driver from Mengistu to Zenawi. We didn't fix the vehicle. Same thing. And the same thing with Nigeria. In Nigeria, the case of the excuse me. The case of Nigeria is even more pitiful. Nigeria keeps changing the driver and the driver from Abu Salam Abubakar to Obasanjo to we go to excuse me. We keep changing the driver, we don't fix the vehicle, so the rat is still there. Now, Nigeria has been fighting corruption, for example, forever. The Economic and Financial Crimes Commission is yet to catch one official bandit and put that bandit into jail. So again, we keep changing the driver, we don't fix the vehicle. Same thing in Uganda. Okay, we have Museveni, who assumed power in 1986. He replaced another dictator that we had there, Okello. Now, Museveni back in 1986 said, no African leader should be in power for more than 10 years. We all hailed him. We said, there's a new leader in Africa. He has been there for almost 33 years. So, yeah, there's a problem that we have. Bad driver, bad vehicle, bad roads. We're not, in case after case, we just change the driver. We don't fix the vehicle, nor the roads. So, here is the problem that I want to lay before you. This is the way I like to see the problem. And I like to stop here and then invite the listeners to ask questions in terms of how do we move Africa forward? How, too often, when we come across a crisis like this, Africans engage in very heated arguments who caused the crisis. Now, there are two schools of thought. There are the externalists who claim that Africa's problems have been caused by the lingering effects of colonialism, the slave trade, the stinginess of the World Bank and the IMF, the unjust international economic system, and many other things, the multinational corporations exploiting Africa. Now, obviously, this is the school of thought which African leaders and many intellectual radicals subscribe to. The reason why African leaders subscribe to this particular orthodoxy is because it absolves them of any responsibility. It places the blame on external factors, colonialism, Western imperialist policies. Mugabe was the epitome of this particular school of thought. Then you had Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, Kaunda. All of these put the blame on Western factors, external factors. But then, after 1989, after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, the whole debate shifted. It shifted because, you see, the externalists drew their strength from the Soviet Union. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, these emperors suddenly found that they have no clothes. And they saw that, there were a rush of coups across Africa, and the coup leaders were blaming corruption, economic mismanagement. That is when the internalists said, hey, look, we acknowledge that there were external factors. External factors such as colonialism did not place Africa in a good state. But the situation in Africa has been made immeasurably worse by bad leaders, incompetent leaders, corruption, senseless civil wars, and so forth. So you have two schools of thought, and the debate is still raging in Africa. But my point of view is that, look, both sides of the argument are valid, because before you cross a road, you look at both sides of the road before you cross it. If you look at only one particular side, at the external, you risk being hit by a truck. Africa is in bandages today because the leaders look only one way at the external causes of the African crisis, and we should look both ways. So I'd like to stop here, and I'm sure that you have plenty of questions to ask me. Thank you very much. Ibrahim, I can't hear you.
Prof, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear
All
you.
right, good. Sorry, I had a little bit problem with the connection. So I said, this is why I love talking to you, Prof. You see, you perfectly laid out the problems, and unfortunately, it is the people in Africa that look both ways before crossing the roads. Our leader doesn't look both ways, so they get jammed by the vehicle, by their own vehicle all the time. And I want to say we're going to have a lot of room for questions. In fact, we have about 1 hour before the end of the webinar, so you can always ask your questions through the comment section or tweet them with the hashtag Why Africa Failed or hashtag African Liberty Webinar. I'm sure to ask Professor Ayittey your questions. But Prof, you made mention of something that really struck me. I was reading the chapter 5 of your book, Applied Economies for Africa, which of course is available on our website for free. You can always download it on our website for free. And in the chapter 5, you made mention of the externalists. And I can remember back in school, um, my professor of political economy, one of the books he recommended was The Africans by the renowned Professor Ali Mazrui. Yeah, you also mentioned it in your in your book. And as you did said, everything in that book literally points to one problem. Africans barely cause their own problem. Majority of our problems are caused by the Europeans. And of course, what Rodney emphasizes in his book, Why How the West Underdeveloped Africa. So I want to say, Prof, um, that in the hand of some of the proposition by these externalists, there is this ubiquitous recommendation among them that Africa would always need foreign financial aid to develop. And of course, we've seen this, influx of aid through the 80s and 90s, which of course put a lot of countries in debt recess. And after the cancellation, now we see the resurgence of Asian, especially Chinese aid in Africa. So will you say considering the enormity of um, development gap in Africa, and of course the great arguments, might be wrong though, the great arguments made by the externalists, do you strongly believe that Africa needs financial aid to address its many development challenges?
Well, that is a very, very good question. And that is, first of all, the externalists, like Ali Mazrui and many African leaders, arguing that um, colonialism, and the slave trade caused Africa's problems. I mean, back in the 1960s, these kind of arguments had some kind of credibility and validity. For example, you look at, let's say, Botswana. When Botswana gained its independence, it only had about um, five, five university graduates. Tanzania had about 12. So you can say that colonialism did not put down any infrastructure at all in terms of, let's say, education, schools, universities. There were many African countries which even lacked, universities. Ghana was one of them. And if you look at even railways, for example, there were only skeletal forms of railways in Africa. In fact, in West Africa, for example, the railways, just went straight inland. And that was all from the port to where there was a mineral deposit or something, just simply to evacuate minerals to export. There was no systematic effort to develop Africa in terms of social development, putting down as education and so forth. But now the externalist argument has lost its credibility because, I mean, if you look at many African countries, many African leaders are very rich because of corruption. The colonialists did not ask Mobutu, for example, to plunder the Zairian economy or the economy of the Congo and amass a personal fortune of $10 billion. Babangida of Nigeria is worth about $9 billion. Omar Bashir of Sudan, $7 billion. Now, you can't blame the colonialists for this. Now, as I also indicated, the one of the reasons why things went so wrong because these leaders established defective economic and political systems. The colonialists did not tell Nkrumah to establish a one-party socialist state in Ghana and himself president for life. The colonialists didn't tell him this. Neither did the colonialists tell Mobutu or tell the rest of the African leaders to establish defective economic and political systems. So these leaders must take responsibility. I mean, the most egregious is Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. The colonialists never told him to establish a Marxist-Leninist state in Zimbabwe. So these leaders, again, must take responsibility for their own failures. That is the way I see it. Now, coming to foreign aid, I do not think Africa really needs foreign aid. The foreign aid, now, let's do some simple math. Total foreign aid to Africa from all sources every year is $45 billion. $45 billion. Now, the situation is like Africa's begging bowl that leaks. $45 billion goes into this bowl, begging bowl. Then out of this bowl leaks corruption, which is $148 billion. And then you have food imports, $35 billion. And then we spend something like $25 billion on military expenditures, capital flight out of Africa, $80 billion. Common sense should tell us that if we plug all those holes in our begging bowl, we might be able to find enough of the resources that we need to develop Africa. But we're not doing that. The leaders prefer to always carry a begging bowl and beg and beg and beg the colonialists or the Western governments for aid. And then when the aid comes, the aid doesn't really reach the people who need it. So that's the situation that we face in Africa.
Absolutely right, Prof. That's really spot on. And I strongly do not believe Africa require aid to develop. As you said, we lose a lot of money to corruption. I think back in was it 2001 that the African Union estimated that we lost about $150 billion annually to corruption alone. And I think it was last year also that the African Development Bank revealed that we lose similar figure to corruption annually, which means things that has barely changed. And we get about $100 billion or something about that from China annually. So why not fix corruption instead of asking for foreign aid?
But
So
we're not even serious in fixing corruption.
we're not serious.
Remember that. Remember this. In February 2014, you have Lamido Sanusi, who was then the Minister of Finance, a governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, told Jonathan, Goodluck Jonathan, that 20 billion in oil revenue was missing. Now, when he told Jonathan, Goodluck Jonathan, that 20 billion in oil revenue was missing, it was he, the governor, who was sacked. They made no effort even to go after the missing billions of dollars. They have not been serious in fighting corruption in Nigeria at all.
Yeah, exactly right, Prof. So we're gonna go to a little bit of question from our audience now, and I just want to remind the listeners that you can always send your questions via the comment section. The comment section should be to the right of your laptop or your mobile device. So we have a couple of questions here, and the one that really keeps looking at me is this very one from Justice Nam, and he said, Prof, do you think that the shift from parliamentary to presidential system of government in the 1960s and 70s contributed to the consolidation of power and democratic governance problem in Africa?
Repeat that question again, please.
So he said he's asking a question about, is it because Africa switched from parliamentary system to presidential system in the 1970s? Is this the reason why we have a lot of consolidation of power among many African leaders?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think the problem is that we haven't fixed the ship of state. Remember, we have a bad vehicle. Now, we haven't fixed that bad vehicle. The parliament is supposed to be an autonomous, independent body that is supposed to check the head of state. But in many countries, in Ghana, for example, the Speaker of Parliament is appointed by the President, which obviously means that it negates this oversight and checks and balances that we're supposed to have in our system. So we don't have that in Ghana. It doesn't really matter. Parliament can do its job if we allow it to be an autonomous institution. If we choose to go let's say, a National Assembly, for example, it can also do its job if we allow it to do its job by making it an autonomous entity. But you can't have Parliament and National Assembly and allow the president to override them and allow the president to interfere with their work. That's the problem that we face in Africa. And as a matter of fact, It's the same thing when we are writing a constitution. The problem that we have is that we write a constitution in Africa and confer a lot of power. We consider the head of state to be a messiah and confer a lot of power onto that particular messiah. Then when he starts abusing those powers, then we are stuck. We find to our chagrin that we don't have any countervailing powers to check him. The correct approach that we need to take in Africa is when we are writing a constitution, we should regard the head of state as a potential bandit, somebody who is going to steal our money. So we put in place measures and checks and balances to constrain him. We don't consider the head of state to be a messiah and give him all the powers. That's the error that we make in Africa.
You're absolutely right, Prof. And that's kind of amusing. So I think you said a lot about the political systems in Africa and why we should sort of integrate it into our past political systems, such as like going back to our indigenous political systems for cues of democratic and political organization. And I think you made a lot of comments about that in your book, Indigenous African Institutions, which I highly recommend. And this is going to lead me to one of the questions from our listeners, from Moshupe. And he said, Prof, what are your thoughts? No, he said, do you think consolidating Africa as one country would deliver economic prosperity and security? What leadership model will deliver economic prosperity for Africa? And does Rwanda's democratic model has some lessons for Africa? And this is from Alfred Ajibang. So he's basically asking about the development model or the political system in Rwanda. That is this, the poster model for Africans to follow.
Well, first of all, the Rwanda model is not a democratic system. And the Rwanda model also is not African. Kagame himself indicated that he went to Singapore and he copied that system. And I have always argued that the Asian tiger model is not suitable for Africa. And that Africa, see, this is what we did in post-colonial Africa. We went abroad and copied all sorts of alien systems and ideologies to impose upon Africa. Rome has a basilica, so we built one in Yamoussoukro, Ivory Coast. The US has a space center, so Nigeria builds an Obasanjo space center. And then we have France once had an emperor, so Bokassa spent $25 million to crown himself emperor. Africa should go back to its own roots and build upon its own indigenous institutions. Africa needs to create its own development model and not just go abroad and copy by heart. So that is why I find the Rwanda model, very troubling. It is doing well, that's fine, but then it is not sustainable. Not sustainable because it is not democratic. You don't need democracy to engineer an economic miracle, but you need democracy to sustain it. Because Rwanda doesn't have a democratic model, its economic miracle is not sustainable. Now, if you talk about going to the indigenous system, we should remember that we had large polities in Africa. We had the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, the Somali Empire, Great Zimbabwe was also an empire. All those empires were confederacies. In other words, a confederation is a loose organization of autonomous states that come together. A confederation is characterized by a great deal of decentralization of power and devolution of authority. Now, after independence, what we did was we retained the European model of governance. That was the unitary state system. The unitary state system concentrates a lot of power at the center. It's like all decisions are made in London, all decisions are made in Paris. So we retain that system, but the unitary state system is not suitable for an African country which is made up of different ethnic groups. Because what happens is that when you concentrate power at the center, one particular ethnic group could capture that power and use that power to advance its interests and then exclude all the others. So it becomes something like an economic apartheid system. And we had that in many countries in Africa, in particular in Rwanda, where the Hutus captured economic power, political and economic power, and tried to exclude the Tutsis. As a matter of fact, they tried to exterminate the Tutsis. And that's what happened to the genocide in 1994 with more than 1 million Tutsis slaughtered. Now, even in Nigeria, you had something like an economic apartheid there, when for much of the independence era, for 30 years, the Hausa captured power and the economic system as well. We also had that in other African countries. So the unitary state system is something that we need to take a very hard look at. There are other systems that we could look at as a solution. As I indicated, confederation is something that we need to take a very hard look at because it is part of our own indigenous African system, or a federation. A federation also allows for the decentralization of power. Now, we are learning that federalism might work in Africa. As a matter of fact, Kenya came up with a new constitution in 2010. They came up with a new constitution and created several federal systems in Kenya. So it's something that we may want to take a look at.
Spot on, Prof. I think it was earlier this year that I was doing a little bit of research into the economic system of early African civilizations, starting from the Nubian kingdoms, the ancient Egypt, and the regions of the On region, especially the Aksum Empire and some other Nubian empire. And I figured out that one of the common traits amongst all these ancient empires was that they had very free markets. In fact, trade was at the heart of their civilization. And coming into your findings, and I think it was in indigenous African institutions that you said trade was also at the heart of medieval African kingdoms, especially the Great Zimbabwe, the Kingdom of Ghana in Ouagadougou, and others. Now, this is going to bring me to the question by one of our listeners on the Africa continental free trade area. Now, I personally believe in that, but I also believe policies on paper aren't enough. We need to walk the talk, and African leaders are not really. They do not have the record of walking their talk, especially when it comes to agreements drafted and agreed upon at the African Union. Now, this audience want to know what you think about the African Free Trade Agreement, and do you think it will improve Africa's economic prospects?
Well, I believe in it, but you just don't get up and just proclaim a free trade zone without making preparations. For example, we have to make sure that, if you want to have really free trade among African countries, you have to demolish all the barriers that impede trade among African countries. I think somebody like in Cape Town, South Africa, wants to sell something in Kampala, Uganda. How do you get your goods from Cape Town to Kampala if you don't have roads? You don't have railways. You don't even have telecommunications, picking up a phone to call somebody in Kampala. Now, you have to make preparations for all this before you announce that, Africa has a free trade agreement or has established a free trade zone. Now, so it is the same thing when you say that Africans can travel freely among them without needing visas, but you don't make sure that you put in place the structures that you need to push this kind of free trade zone together. So yes, I believe in the African free trade zone. As a matter of fact, I have written in my book that we had free trade routes in Africa. The trans-Saharan free trade route was part of our culture. So we need that to boost trade within Africa. As a matter of fact, we don't trade among ourselves in Africa at all. Intra-African trade constitutes less than 10% of total African trade. Let me repeat this. Intra-African trade constitutes less than 10% of total African trade. So the question is, how do we trade with foreigners when we don't even know how to trade among ourselves? It is important that we have a free trade zone in Africa. But at the same time, we just don't get up without making any preparations. We have to make sure that we demolish all those barriers that impede intra-African trade.
Absolutely, Prof, and that's really really right. And I think one of the books that I actually find quite interesting, because here I've related with a lot of Africans in the diaspora, especially those in the economics field, and one of the things they do find quite difficult is to investigate the economic history of Africa, especially from the ancient times to the medieval kingdoms. And I think if many of our economics can look back at how Africans survived during this period, they will quite find a lot of answers. And one of the questions here that I think relates to what you just said is about the having a free market um, proposition for Africa. Now, of course, I understand deeply that a lot of African civilizations and societies experimented and had a great amount of success with free market reforms or free market ideas in the past before colonialism. But modern capitalism is quite different from what we used to know back in the day. And this commentator wants to know, Qasim Sulaiman wants to know if you think free markets in its purest form can work for Africa, considering the fact that, as he said, that marketers really exploit consumers in Africa. So do you think free market in its purest form can work for Africa?
Well, that is the question that is asking is a different animal. But that relates more to, say, the informal sector. You can divide it now. Let me put it this way. You can divide an African economy into three sectors. There is the modern sector. And then the modern sector is where you have, the multinational corporations and modern firms and so forth. And then you have the informal sector, and then the traditional or rural sector. The informal sector is a transitional sector between the rural and the modern sector. The informal sector is where you have things like bakeries, bicycle repair, food vending. Now, those in that particular sector, you don't need to have, you don't need to register a business. You don't even need to have a license to operate. Now, the vast majority of the poor in Africa can be found in the informal and the rural sectors. So it depends. What is your purpose or what is your objective? If your objective is to create employment for large numbers of people, for the poor, then you need to focus on the informal and the traditional sectors. Now, here is the problem. Now, of those three sectors, after independence, the African leaders focused on the formal sector because they wanted to create, their motto was industrialization. And industrialization focused on the modern sector. So you take Ivory Coast, for example. 70% of Ivory Coast development was concentrated around Abidjan in the modern sector. If you concentrate your development on the modern sector, it means that you're not going to create enough employment for your people. So you're going to have a huge jobless rate. You take Zimbabwe, for example. The jobless rate in Zimbabwe right now is almost 80% in Zimbabwe. The modern sector doesn't create enough jobs for the people because the modern sector has literally collapsed. It doesn't provide, there's very little, Zimbabweans can only count on 6 hours a day of electricity. Clean water is not available most of the week. In Nigeria, for example, if you want to open a factory, you have to establish your own electricity generating plant, supply your own water supply system, and maybe build your own road to ship your products, finished products to market. Now, all this is very, very expensive. So, the question that which type of strategy we should have for industrialization, to me, is somewhat premature. You have to make sure that we know what we're trying to do. If you want to help the poor and create jobs for the poor, to create jobs for the poor, you don't need to have a very formalized industrial sector. What you need is more of your jobs could be created in the informal sector. And with the informal sector, what you need to do is to provide some basic services like clean water, electricity, and so forth. And to be able to create a lot of jobs in the informal sector. As a matter of fact, in 2010, Ghana and Nigeria started to include activities of the informal sector, into their normal economic national accounting. And this was able to boost their GNP, up by almost 30%. So they can do a lot in improving the informal sector to employ many people and boost their economies. But it is not so much in I know there's a lot of people who are worried about, competing with the multinational corporations on the world stage. But we need to create employment for our people. And the way to do that is to look at the informal and the traditional sectors.
I strongly agree, Prof. The informal sector is the nerve of the African economy. Now we can't just live without it. And I want us to move to more political question now rather than economics. And I see that one of the most common topic of question from our audience is about the United States of Africa. I personally believe that the African Union is one living testimony why a United States of Africa might not work. And our audience wants to know your opinion about that, especially as regards the adoption of a single currency and a common language.
I think the common currency is feasible, but the common language is, I would say that it's a pipe dream. Even the Europeans have not been able to come up with their own common currency in the European Union. But I think the United States of Africa idea is appealing to me personally, because I think that we have too many countries in Africa, and many of them are too small to be economically viable. and that we need to create, even larger states within Africa. So it would be better for us to be to all come together and form something like um, I wouldn't call that United States of Africa, but to create some kind of a confederation of African states. That's what I'll call it, a confederation of Africa. I'll call it a confederation of free African states. To put the emphasis on free or liberty, because the African Union idea or pulling Africa together, I thought that was a step in the right direction, but once again, it sort of reflects this copycat mentality that we have. Europe has a European Union, so Africa must have an African Union. Just like Rome has a basilica, so Africa must have a basilica. That kind of, you know, uh, ridiculous mentality. We need to have a confederation of African states. And I personally would say that we should let North Africa go, because North Africa is Arab. And they are more oriented towards the Middle East than towards the South Africa south of the Sahara. Africa south of the Sahara should all be roped into a confederation of African states. And then we should have the common currency. I have always suggested that we should have a common currency called the Inti. I just pulled that from the top of my head, Inti. And that, and we should back that currency with gold. We have lots of gold deposits in Africa. We should back that currency with gold. If we back that currency with gold, it will be one of the strongest currencies in the world, because it will protect holders of that currency against inflation. For example, now if Zimbabwe had done that, Zimbabwe has vast deposits of gold. If it had done that, then it would have been able to save its currency. But it printed so much of its currency that in 2009, the inflation rate in Zimbabwe was more than 1 million%. And they even printed what you might call a 100 quadrillion banknote. 100 quadrillion banknote is a quadrillion is has let me see, has 12 zeros at the end of it. Can you imagine? 12 zeros at the end of it. But anyway, they totally destroyed their currency and they had to adopt the US currency, the US dollar and the South African rand as their currencies. But we can do better in the new Africa, where we have the Inti backed by cold gold.
Prof, that's that's going to divide a lot of commentators on African economy. Some would never believe that Africa would do better, unifying rather than splitting up and focusing on our indigenous processes. But I'd like to bring you to a little bit of more political and anthropological question, and that's going to be about you know the influence of populism in Africa, especially questions of open border or closed border policies being adopted by some African countries. Recently, we've seen that Nigeria closed its border just to ban the importation of rice, and some African countries have already following suit. So, what do you think about you know adopting some protectionist measures to make sure that African industries, indigenous industries, um, grow to the extent of being able to compete with foreign industries? Is protectionism good?
First of all, let me check whether you can still see me, because I think we must have lost the video link. Hello?
I can hear you, Prof. I think one of our audience just pop up their screen. Okay, I just fixed that. one of our audience made a mistake by opening up their screen. But we should be good now, Prof. You are muted, Prof. Um, can you please unmute your audio? Yeah, we can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Sorry for that break.
Okay. Well, I would prefer that we encourage our own domestic production of rice. Domestic production of rice. And there's nothing wrong with encouraging domestic production of rice. Even the US does it all the time, encouraging its own farmers. We should always encourage our own farmers and our own domestic producers. And the way to do this is to use tariffs and not outright ban on importations of, let's say, rice. And sometimes Nigerian government, sometimes we try to take drastic measures, like banning the importation of certain goods. It's not good, You can impose tariffs and gradually raise them or reduce them, depending upon whether you want to encourage domestic production or not. So that is the way I would go.
We have another questions here from Musupe, and he said, how do you think the African Union and other groups like the SADC and ECOWAS and the African Development Bank can more effectively ensure or encourage fair elections in the continent and political and fair elections towards African development?
Well, it's a very good question. Conventionally, what the African Union does is when there's going to be election, the African Union sends an observer team to that particular country. And then after the elections, regardless of how the elections are held, the African Union always comes up with a report tracing how the elections were free and fair. I have never seen an election in Africa which the African Union doesn't like. The African Union even can't even define democracy in Africa itself. Look, in 2014, Rwanda held an election in which this opposition leader, Victoire Ingabire, stood for elections. They threw her in jail. And in 2017, there was another election in Rwanda which was contested by Diane Rwigara. Kagame threw her too in jail on trumped-up charges of tax evasion. The African Union said nothing. As a matter of fact, if the African Union wants to encourage free and fair elections in Africa, it ought to make sure that the opposition candidate also have equal access to the media, and any attempt to intimidate the opposition in that particular country should be condemned by the African Union. Now, take a look at Egypt, for example. Egypt held the elections in March of this particular year. Now, all those who contested against President al-Sisi found themselves in jail. The African Union said nothing. As a matter of fact, at that time, The African Union was holding a meeting in Egypt. So look, the African Union needs to clean up its act. Yes, it can do a lot to promote democracy in Africa. But to do so, it doesn't have to send an observer team to that particular country and issue a glowing report after the elections have been stolen. They have to make sure that the opposition candidates have equal access to the media. The opposition candidates are not intimidated, and so forth. That is the only way we can guarantee free and fair elections in Africa.
I absolutely concur, Prof. And I also think elections in Africa is more of ethnic censorship rather than a democratic process to determine who leads us. So it's a no-brainer. And that's going to lead me to a more political question here from Dixon. He wants to know your opinion about the fact that many of our post-independent African leaders were young when they came into power. One, I think, was 31 in Nigeria. Mugabe was quite young too, and many of the North African leaders were equally young. In fact, in Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, and the other post-independent leaders were not old, quite young, and many of them, as we know, stay in power for quite long and never want to leave power. So now they do not want the young ones to take up, the power mantle. So our audience wants to know why you think this is a problem, and if at all you think young people can move Africa forward.
Well, it is true that the first generation of African leaders were young when they took over power, but one of the qualities of leadership is to recognize the limitations of your own capabilities. Okay? The skills that you need to win a liberation struggle are not the same skills that you need to run an economy successfully. Let me repeat that. The skills that you need to wage the liberation struggle are not the same skills that you need to run an economy successfully. These leaders, liberation heroes, should have realized that in the 1960s and after independence, they should have passed the baton on to those who were better suited or better qualified to run economies. They didn't. And in country after country after country, their lack of experience and incompetence became glaringly, apparent that they run their economies, their countries, one by one into an economic slump. The latest was Zimbabwe, where Mugabe totally destroyed the economy. So it's not a question so much of youth. It's a question of having the experience to run an economy. If you don't have the experience or the knowledge, get the hell out of the way and let somebody who has the experience run the economy. And this is also why today we need better qualified people. I mean, it doesn't matter whether they are young or old, so long as they have the skills to run the economy, they should be allowed to do so.
I can't agree more than what you said there, Prof. So we are in the final lap of the webinar, and I want to use the last 10 minutes to talk more about your book. African Liberty, in conjunction with African Students for Liberty, will be publishing thousands of copies of this book for distribution on the continent. And Prof, I don't know if you want to talk about your book briefly.
Well, I'd like to invite listeners to become part of the African Liberty Organization and School, and also to post questions that they have across Africa. As a matter of fact, the book, Applied Economics for Africa, is being printed in Nigeria, in Kenya, and it will be made available. And I will appreciate it if those who listen to this talk will sort of download or purchase this book. The book is free, and sort of help distribute this book. across Africa. Now, we are at a crossroads in Africa, and we need a new way of thinking about Africa. The old way in which we blamed everything on the colonialists and Western powers, that always passe. It doesn't work anymore. Even the peasants of the rural people, the rural folks in Africa, no longer believe in that crap. They can see that the leaders have failed them. I mean, look at Museveni of Uganda, for example. The man has been there for 33 years. What has he produced for the country? The country is still poor. That's why the immense natural mineral wealth that the country possesses. Go to Equatorial Guinea. You have Obiang, who's been there for more than 30 years. What has he done for his people? 60% of the Equatorial Guineans are still poor. Cameroon is even more pathetic. You have Paul Biya, who has been in power for almost 40 years. The man doesn't even stay in the country. He's holed up in a chateau in Switzerland, of course, to count his millions of dollars that he has looted from the Cameroon. Look, the leadership in many African countries is a disgrace, and we should not be defending them. We should stop making excuses for them. We need new leadership in Africa. And like I said, the problem in Africa is we have bad leaders, bad vehicle, bad roads, bad strategy. We need, after changing the bad drivers, we also need to fix the vehicle and fix the bad roads that we have. That is the task that I'll put across the young Africans that are called the cheetah generation in Africa, and rise up to the task of putting Africa on a new road to development.
Great. I believe what you said, Prof. And our leaders have created a lot of mess since 1960, and they don't stay around to live by the mess they created. In fact, I know one leader that we always go to London almost every month for medical checkup, despite spending billions in investment in healthcare system. They just absolute nonsense people. But as Prof said, African Liberty and African Students for Liberty is dedicated for promotion of free market ideas and ideas that will usher Africa's prosperity through training and online journalism and advocacy. And you can visit our website, africanliberty.org, for further information, or apply for our Pioneer program, which is called the Local Coordinators Program. You can find the link to the program right in the comment section, or just Google SFL Local Coordinators Program. We've trained thousands of leaders across the world, and many in Africa, whom have helped organize top-notch programs. And will be helping us with the distribution of the books Dr. Ayittey recently published, titled Applied Economies for Africa. If you want to help with the distribution of this book on your campus, or to your friends, kindly email us at editor@africanliberty.org, or chat me up on Twitter. I'm at Ibrahim Anoba on Twitter. You can follow African Liberty and chat African Liberty up on Twitter at African Liberty, and we'll be glad to help you with that. So with this, I would like to thank Professor Ayittey for kindly providing us this always interesting idea about African development, and really appreciate you, Prof. And we hope you can join us next time we invite you.